I didn't realize my life was about to split in two until I felt the weight of my laptop cutting into my palm. It was heavier than usual, or maybe my hands were just shaking. The hallway lights buzzed softly above me, that low electric hum you never notice until everything else goes quiet. Behind me, the door to my office, was closing. Not fast, not angry, just slow enough to feel deliberate, just soft enough to feel final. For a second, I thought, this is a misunderstanding. That's what I always thought. That's what kept me calm when I should have been alert. I turned around, already forming words in my head, already rehearsing how I'd explain myself, defend myself, prove myself, again. But my mom was standing there with her arms crossed, her expression smooth and settled, like a decision had already been made hours ago. Maybe days ago. Maybe longer. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look guilty. She looked relieved. "Take some time," she said quietly. "We'll handle things for now." Time. That word landed wrong. Time from what? From work. From responsibility. From the place I had poured years of my life into. I waited for the rest of the sentence. Something like, "We'll talk later," or "This isn't permanent." But nothing came. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, and that's when I noticed the people behind her. Colleagues. Employees. Faces I recognized instantly. Faces that had once looked at me for answers. No one said my name. No one stepped forward. No one looked me in the eye. That was the moment everything broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but internally, in a way that doesn't show on the outside until much later. I felt something detach inside my chest, like a rope snapping after being pulled too tight for too long. I wanted to ask a question. Any question. But my mouth wouldn't cooperate. All the confidence I walked in with evaporated in seconds, replaced by a quiet, humiliating confusion. I remember thinking, don't react. Don't give them that. So I nodded. I actually nodded. I adjusted my grip on the laptop like it was just another normal day. Like I was simply stepping out for a meeting, like I belonged somewhere else I needed to be. My feet moved before my brain caught up. Each step down that hallway felt unreal, like I was watching myself from above, detached, numb. As I passed the glass walls of the office, I saw my reflection. I barely recognized the person staring back. The same clothes I'd worn proudly that morning now felt like a costume. The same badge clipped to my belt felt heavy, unnecessary. A symbol of something I apparently no longer had. I wanted to turn back. I wanted to demand answers. I wanted someone, anyone, to stop me and say, "This isn't right," but no one did. When I reached the elevator, my hand hovered over the button longer than it should have. There was still time, I told myself. I could go back. I could say something. I could refuse to leave. But another thought crept in, quieter and more dangerous. What if they want you gone more than you want to stay? That thought froze me. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped inside like a man obeying an unspoken order. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of the office floor. People returning to their desks, conversations resuming, life continuing without missing a beat. Without me, the descent felt too fast. My ears popped slightly, my stomach dropped, and suddenly I was in the lobby, surrounded by strangers who had no idea my world had just collapsed 30 seconds ago. I walked past the reception desk, past the security gate, and out into the morning air. The sun was bright, almost offensively so. Cars passed. People laughed. Someone nearby was complaining about coffee being too hot. Everything was normal, and that somehow made it worse. I stood there on the sidewalk, holding my laptop like proof that I still existed, like evidence that I hadn't imagined what just happened. That's when it hit me. I hadn't been fired. I hadn't been confronted. I hadn't been accused. I had been quietly removed. There was something especially cruel about that realization. No argument to win. No injustice to expose. Just a clean, silent push out the door, executed by the person who was supposed to protect me more than anyone else. My mom. That word echoed in my head as I replayed her face, her tone, her calm certainty. I searched for signs of hesitation, for cracks in her composure that might mean this wasn't intentional. I found none, and that hurt more than anger ever could. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My phone buzzed once. Then again, emails, notifications, work messages still coming through, still treating me like I was in charge, like nothing had changed. I didn't answer any of them. I couldn't. I didn't know who I was supposed to be responding as anymore. On the drive home, my mind raced backward, scanning years of memories for the exact moment this became possible. The late nights, the compromises, the times I stayed quiet to keep peace, the moments I ignored my own instincts because family comes first. I felt embarrassed for not seeing it sooner. I felt angry at myself for trusting too easily. But mostly, I felt hollow. When I finally got home, I set the laptop down on the table and stared at it. That machine held my work, my ideas, my plans, everything I thought secured my place. And yet, none of it had protected me when it mattered. That's when the fear crept in. Not loud fear. Quiet fear. The kind that asks questions you don't want to answer. If they could push you out this easily, were you ever really in? I sat there alone, replaying the sound of that door closing in my head. Over and over. Soft, controlled, final. And with every replay, the truth became harder to avoid. This wasn't just about an office. This was about being erased without warning. And I didn't yet know that this moment, the calmest, looking betrayal of my life, was only the beginning. The worst part didn't hit me right away. It waited. It followed me home. It sat quietly in the corners of my mind until the shock wore off and the noise of the day finally died down. That's when the humiliation started to sink in. Not as a single moment, but as a slow, suffocating realization that I had been dismissed in front of everyone, and no one had tried to stop it. I kept replaying their faces. Not my mom's this time, but the others, the people who had once laughed with me during late nights at the office. The ones who used to knock on my door for advice, for approval, for protection. I searched those memories for even one sign of resistance. One raised eyebrow, one step forward, one quiet, "Hey, maybe we should talk about this." There was nothing. And that silence was louder than any argument could have been. I realized something that night that I didn't want to admit. Fear is contagious. The moment power shifts, loyalty becomes optional. People don't betray you with knives. They do it by standing still while someone else pushes you off the edge. My phone buzzed again. More messages. Work-related. Polite. Carefully worded. No one asked if I was okay. No one said, "That wasn't right." They spoke to me like I was already a memory. Useful, but no longer necessary. I typed responses and deleted them. Over and over. Every message felt like a test I didn't know how to pass. If I protested, I'd look weak. If I stayed silent, I'd disappear. I chose silence because at least it was mine. That night, I barely ate. Food tasted like nothing. I sat on the edge of my bed, scrolling through old photos on my phone. Team dinners. Office celebrations. Smiling faces with arms around my shoulders. Proof that I had mattered once. Proof that belonging can be temporary when it's borrowed from the wrong people. I wondered what they were saying about me now. Were they rewriting the story? Had my absence already been explained away as a break, a mutual decision, a necessary change? I imagined my name being spoken in softer tones, stripped of authority, reduced to something safe and manageable. That thought made my chest tighten. By morning, the fear had evolved. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was exposure. I realized how public this was, how visible my removal had been. Everyone knew. Everyone had watched. And everyone had learned the same lesson at the same time. I was no longer protected. When I stepped outside the next day, I felt it immediately. The way the world looked slightly different when you know you've lost something important. Every interaction felt heavier. Every glance felt imagined, but I couldn't shake the feeling that people knew. That they could see the mark on me. The invisible sign that says, "This one fell." I checked my bank account more times than I'd like to admit. Not because it was empty, but because fear makes you do math you never used to care about. I calculated how long I could survive if this wasn't temporary. Weeks. Months. Long enough to figure something out, I told myself. Long enough to breathe. But the real panic wasn't financial. It was identity. I had wrapped so much of myself around that role, that office, that responsibility. Without it, I felt untethered, like someone had erased my title and expected me to still know who I was without it. Friends reached out. A few, at least. They asked vague questions. "Everything okay? Heard you're taking time off." I gave vague answers in return. Smiles in text form. Casual reassurances. I didn't trust myself to speak the truth yet. The truth felt too raw, too sharp. Like if I said it out loud, it would become permanent. Inside, though, I was unraveling. I kept thinking about how easily it happened. How there was no meeting, no warning, no discussion. Just a quiet consensus that I was expendable. And the most painful part was knowing that the decision didn't require force. It required permission. And everyone gave it by doing nothing. That realization isolated me more than being physically alone ever could. I felt separated from everyone who had witnessed it, like there was now a wall between us made of shared cowardice and unspoken agreement. They knew I'd been wronged. I knew they knew, and we all pretended otherwise. I stopped checking my phone for a while. I needed space from the reminders of what I'd lost. In the silence, memories grew louder. Doubts grew sharper. I questioned every choice I'd made leading up to that moment. Every time I'd defended someone who wouldn't defend me. Every time I'd ignored discomfort for the sake of harmony. I wondered if this was my fault. That thought scared me most of all. Because if it was, then maybe I deserved it. Maybe I hadn't been strong enough. Maybe I'd mistaken kindness for leadership. Maybe I'd trained people to overlook me by always stepping back. Those thoughts are dangerous. They don't shout. They whisper. And they sound a lot like your own voice. I caught myself staring at nothing for long stretches of time, lost in internal arguments that went nowhere. I imagined confronting them. Imagined speeches. Imagined justice. And then imagined the aftermath. Awkward silences, closed doors, more isolation. The risk felt too high, so I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, something else happened. The fear settled into my bones. Not the kind that makes you panic, but the kind that makes you careful. The kind that teaches you how fragile your position always was. How quickly stability can disappear when it's built on approval instead of ownership. I began to understand something I hadn't before. Being pushed out wasn't just about losing a job. It was about losing the illusion of safety. The illusion that loyalty is mutual. The illusion that being good, being patient, being family is enough to protect you. That understanding hurt more than the moment itself. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And as the hours turned into days, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever came next, I would face it alone. The first few days felt like free fall. No schedule, no calls that mattered, no place I had to be. On paper, it sounded like rest. In reality, it felt like being erased from the rhythm of life. I kept waking up at the same time out of habit, my body still loyal to a routine my life no longer required. For a few seconds every morning, I'd forget, and then the memory would rush back in, heavy and unforgiving. I stopped wearing my work clothes. There was no reason to. I stayed in the same hoodie for hours, sometimes all day, because changing felt pointless. The mirror became something I avoided. I didn't like the version of myself staring back, uncertain, stripped of purpose, waiting for instructions that would never come. Money became a quiet obsession. I wasn't broke, but I wasn't comfortable either. Every purchase came with a calculation. Every bill felt louder than it used to. I started cutting things without thinking. Subscriptions, dinners out, small comforts I'd once considered harmless. Survival has a way of shrinking your world. You don't notice it happening until everything feels smaller. I tried applying for work. That was humbling in ways I hadn't prepared for. Writing my own experience felt strange, like I was trying to convince strangers that I mattered. Interviews felt worse. Smiles that didn't reach eyes. Compliments that went nowhere. "We'll get back to you." They rarely did. Each rejection landed quietly but stacked heavily. I didn't tell anyone. Admitting it felt like confirming everyone's unspoken doubts about me. So I carried it alone, one more invisible weight added to the pile. Some nights, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the city breathe outside my window. Cars passing, distant voices, life continuing without any awareness of my internal collapse. I thought about the office. I imagined meetings happening without me. Decisions being made in rooms I once led. The idea hurt, but not as much as the realization that the world hadn't paused when I left. That's when survival stopped being theoretical. I took work I never thought I'd take. Short-term contracts, consulting gigs, anything that paid, anything that kept me moving. Pride became a luxury I couldn't afford. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was learning. I told myself whatever I needed to hear to get through the day. There were moments of shame I don't talk about easily. Moments when I questioned my worth based on my bank balance. Moments when I avoided friends because I didn't want to explain why my life looked smaller now. I skipped gatherings, made excuses. Isolation felt safer than pity, but something strange happened in that isolation. Without the noise, without the constant need to perform, I started hearing my own thoughts again. Not the panicked ones. The quieter ones underneath. The ones that asked uncomfortable questions I'd been too busy to answer before. Why had I tied my identity so tightly to a role that could be taken from me? Why had I confused loyalty with self-sacrifice? Why had I stayed silent for so long? Those questions didn't accuse me. They challenged me. I started writing again, not for anyone else, just for me. Pages and pages of things I'd never said out loud. Anger, grief, regret, clarity. I didn't edit myself. I didn't protect anyone. I let the truth come out messy and unfiltered. It felt like bleeding, but it also felt like release. Some days were still hard. Really hard. There were mornings when getting out of bed felt like a negotiation. Days when progress seemed imaginary, but I kept going, not because I felt hopeful, but because stopping felt worse. Slowly, very slowly, I noticed a shift. I was no longer waiting for permission to move forward. I was building small systems of my own. Simple routines. Clear boundaries. Work that belonged to me, even if it wasn't glamorous. Especially because it wasn't glamorous. I learned how to survive without applause. Without titles. Without validation. And in that process, I discovered a version of strength I'd never needed before. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that demands recognition. The quiet kind that shows up every day, even when no one is watching. I stopped checking my phone as much. Stopped expecting messages that never came. The silence that once terrified me became something I could sit with. I realized I'd been confusing attention with connection, business with importance. One afternoon, while working alone at a small table near a window, it hit me. This wasn't rock bottom. This was ground level. This was me learning how to stand without leaning on structures that didn't truly support me. I still felt the loss. That didn't disappear, but it no longer defined every breath I took. It became part of the story, not the whole thing. Survival changed me. It stripped me down, yes, but it also gave me something back. Perspective, ownership, a sense of self that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. I wasn't thriving yet, not even close. But I wasn't disappearing anymore. And for the first time since that door closed behind me, that felt like enough to keep going. It happened quietly, the realization. No dramatic moment, no sudden clarity like in the movies. Just a slow understanding that settled in one afternoon and refused to leave. I was sitting alone, scrolling through old emails, not for any practical reason. Just out of habit. Messages from years ago. Decisions I'd made. Permissions I'd given without realizing I was giving them away. And that's when I saw it, not a single email. Not one message, but a pattern. Every time I had stepped back, someone else had stepped forward. Every time I'd softened a boundary to keep peace, the line had moved a little further against me. I hadn't been pushed out all at once. I'd been slowly edged out, one quiet compromise at a time. That truth stung more than anger ever could. I had spent so long blaming the moment, blaming my mom, blaming the people who stood there in silence. And yes, they were responsible for what they did. But I couldn't ignore the part I played anymore. I had taught them how to treat me, not intentionally, not knowingly, but consistently. I had mistaken patience for strength, silence for maturity, endurance for loyalty, and in doing so I had made myself easy to remove. That realization was painful because it stripped me of the comfort of being purely wronged. It forced me to sit with my own choices, the ways I'd avoided conflict, the times I'd swallowed discomfort instead of addressing it, the moments I told myself, "This is just how family works." I thought back to the early days, when my voice had been clearer, when I'd pushed back without apology. Somewhere along the way, I'd learned that keeping things calm was more important than being honest. I'd learned that being agreeable felt safer than being firm. But safe for who? Not for me. I began to see the office differently in my memory, the meetings where my ideas were slowly rephrased by others. The decisions that required my input less and less. The subtle shifts in authority I'd felt but ignored because acknowledging them would have meant confronting someone I loved. Family complicates everything. It blurs lines that should stay sharp. It makes you doubt instincts that would be obvious in any other situation. I had given trust where boundaries were needed, and love where clarity was required. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I stopped framing the story as a sudden betrayal and started seeing it as a long erosion. No single act dramatic enough to protest, but together, devastating. It wasn't just about control. It was about narrative. About who was allowed to lead and who was expected to step aside quietly when the time came. I realized something else too. The begging that came later, the apologies, the sudden respect, had less to do with remorse and more to do with consequence. I had underestimated my own value because I'd grown used to minimizing myself. That they hadn't realized what my absence would cost them because I'd never made my contribution visible. That was a hard pill to swallow. I'd believed that if I worked hard enough, stayed loyal enough, everything would balance out naturally. That effort alone would protect me. But effort without boundaries doesn't earn respect. It invites exploitation. That thought made me angry. Not at them, but at the version of myself who thought self-erasure was a form of love. I sat with that anger instead of pushing it away. I let it teach me. Anger, I learned, isn't always destructive. Sometimes it's a signal. A message that something inside you knows you deserved better. The realization changed how I spoke, even to myself. I stopped softening my language, stopped apologizing for existing, stopped explaining my worth in ways that made it smaller. I also stopped romanticizing reconciliation. The idea of things going back to how they were lost its appeal. I didn't want to return to a version of myself that could be quietly replaced. I wanted something different. Something honest. That clarity hurt relationships. Some people noticed the shift and pulled away. Others pushed back, uncomfortable with the new boundaries I set. I let them. Loss stopped terrifying me once I understood what staying had cost. The hardest part was accepting that love doesn't excuse harm. That intention doesn't erase impact. That family can be both important and unsafe at the same time. Those truths don't fit neatly together, but they coexist whether we like it or not. I stopped asking why they did it. I started asking why I stayed. And in that question, I found something close to forgiveness, not for them, but for myself. Forgiveness for not knowing sooner. For doing the best I could with the tools I had at the time. The realization didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the past, but it gave me something more valuable than closure. It gave me direction. I knew now what I wouldn't tolerate again. I knew the cost of silence. I knew that being loved should never require disappearing. And with that knowledge, I stepped forward differently. Not louder, not harsher, but clearer than I'd ever been before. Because once you understand the truth of how you lost yourself, you stop being afraid of finding yourself again. I didn't plan to expose anything. That part still matters to me. I wasn't chasing revenge, sympathy, or attention. I was tired of holding a truth that felt heavier every time I tried to keep it quiet. The silence had protected everyone else long enough, and all it had done for me was teach me how lonely restraint can be. It started small. A post I almost didn't publish. Words typed late at night, not polished, not strategic, just honest. I didn't name names. I didn't point fingers. I just told my story the way it felt from the inside. The confusion, the dismissal, the quiet removal. I expected maybe a few people to read it. I expected nothing to change. I was wrong. By morning, messages were waiting. Not from the people I expected, but from strangers. People who recognized themselves in my words. People who had been pushed out of spaces they helped build. People who had been silenced by family, by partners, by institutions that benefited from their quiet loyalty. They thanked me for saying what they couldn't. That's when I realized the truth I'd been protecting wasn't just mine. It was shared. And once shared, it had weight. The reaction inside the office was immediate, even though no one acknowledged it directly. Meetings were canceled. Conversations shifted. The tone of messages changed. Where there had been distance, there was suddenly urgency. Where there had been confidence, there was now caution. I hadn't accused anyone, but the truth has a way of locating its own targets. My phone started ringing again. Calls I'd missed days earlier were suddenly returned. Apologies came dressed as concern. We didn't realize you felt this way. There must have been a misunderstanding. Let's talk. I listened. That alone changed the dynamic. I noticed how quickly the narrative softened when it no longer belonged solely to them. How responsibility became blurred once it couldn't be buried. I saw how uncomfortable people became when asked to stand in the light of a story they'd hoped would stay in the dark. The exposure wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. The same people who had watched silently before were now asking careful questions. The same ones who had avoided my eyes were suddenly eager to be seen listening. And I understood something then: silence gives power to the wrong people. Not because they deserve it, but because no one challenges it. I didn't celebrate that shift. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. For the first time since being pushed out, I wasn't shrinking to make the situation easier for everyone else. I wasn't explaining myself into a corner. I was simply present, grounded in truth, and that was enough. There were consequences, of course. Exposure always has a cost. Some relationships didn't survive it. Some people chose distance over accountability. I let them go. Clarity has a way of simplifying things. You stop chasing understanding from those committed to misunderstanding you. What surprised me most was how little I needed their validation anymore. Once the truth was out, I no longer felt responsible for managing everyone's comfort. I wasn't trying to be liked. I was trying to be honest. That honesty attracted the right kind of support. Not pity, not outrage, understanding. People who didn't rush me. People who didn't try to rewrite my experience. They simply said, "I believe you." That mattered more than any apology. Inside the office, things kept shifting. I heard about it through indirect channels. Processes breaking down. Decisions stalling. Gaps becoming visible where my work used to be. It wasn't satisfying to hear, but it was clarifying. My absence had revealed the truth faster than my presence ever could have. That's when the begging began. Not dramatic pleas, not tears. Careful, calculated requests. Invitations to talk. Offers to rebuild. Promises that things would be different this time. They spoke about the future like the past hadn't happened, like truth could be negotiated. I didn't rush to answer. Exposure had taught me patience. Real patience, not the self-erasing kind. The kind that waits for alignment, not reassurance. I paid attention to what wasn't said. To the apologies that avoided specifics. To the concern that centered impact, not intent. I measured words against actions and found gaps that no promise could fill. For the first time, I wasn't desperate to return. I wasn't afraid of being left out. I knew what I brought to the table, and I knew what it cost me to be there without protection. The exposure had shifted the balance of power, not because I demanded it, but because truth repositions people whether they like it or not. It forces choices. It forces consequences. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need an apology tour. I needed acknowledgement, and more importantly, I needed change. And I understood then that exposure isn't about destroying others. It's about reclaiming yourself. It's about refusing to carry a story alone when it was never yours to hide. The truth did what silence never could. It set the stage for consequences. When they finally asked me to come back, it wasn't dramatic. No grand speech. No emotional confession. Just a message that tried to sound casual and failed. Carefully chosen words, softened edges, a tone that suggested urgency without admitting desperation. I read it slowly, then again, it feeling how different it landed compared to the silence that came before. I didn't respond right away. That alone was new. A few weeks earlier, I would have replied within minutes, eager to prove I was still dependable, still reasonable, still worthy of being included. Now, I set the phone down and let the quiet exist. I wanted to hear my own thoughts before anyone else's voice entered the room. They asked for a meeting. I agreed. On my terms. Different location. Clear agenda. No surprises. I noticed how quickly they accepted conditions that would have once been questioned. Power had shifted, not loudly, but unmistakably. When I walked in, the room felt different. Not hostile. Not warm. Cautious. People stood when I entered. Not out of respect, but uncertainty. They weren't sure who I was anymore, and that uncertainty unsettled them. My mom was there. That was the hardest part. She looked older than I remembered. Tired in a way that no amount of authority can hide. When our eyes met, she looked away first. That small moment said more than any apology could have. They spoke about mistakes. About miscommunication. About intentions. I let them talk. I didn't interrupt. I listened the way I wish someone had listened to me that day in the hallway. When they finished, The room waited for my response like it was holding its breath. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't revisit every wound. I spoke calmly, clearly, and without emotion they could use against me. I named what happened. I named how it affected me. I named what would need to change for anything to move forward. Some of it made them uncomfortable. Good. Growth rarely feels polite. When it came time to decide, I surprised them. I didn't say yes. And I didn't say no. I said, not like before. That was the line. I told them I wouldn't return to a space where my authority could be quietly dismantled. I wouldn't accept roles without protection. I wouldn't confuse family with immunity. If I came back, it would be with structure, transparency, and boundaries that couldn't be erased by convenience. They agreed to more than I expected: policies, accountability, written agreements, shared decision-making, things that should have existed from the start, but only appeared once the cost of losing me became real. And still, I hesitated. Because consequences aren't just for the people who hurt you. They're for you too. They require you to change, not just demand that others do. Returning meant risking old patterns. It meant trusting myself to speak up the moment something felt off, not months later. I took time. More than they liked. Less than I needed. I weighed the opportunity against the peace I'd built on my own. I asked myself whether I was returning out of strength or habit. That question mattered. In the end, I made a choice that honored both my past and my future. I returned, but not as the person who had been pushed out. I returned as someone who knew his value and was prepared to walk away again if that value was compromised. The consequences were immediate. Dynamics changed. Conversations were more careful. Decisions were documented. Authority was clearer. Some people resented it. Others respected it. I didn't need either. I needed safety. My relationship with my mom shifted too. It became more distant, but more honest. We stopped pretending everything was fine. We stopped using love as a shield against accountability. It was uncomfortable, but it was real. Not everyone was happy with the outcome. Some expected me to come back grateful. Others expected forgiveness without effort. I offered neither. I offered professionalism, clarity, and consistency. And for the first time, that was enough. Looking back, being pushed out was the catalyst. It forced consequences that never would have existed otherwise. It revealed who could adapt and who could not. It showed me the cost of silence and the power of standing firm. I don't romanticize what happened. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But I don't regret it either. Because it taught me something I carry into every room now. Belonging should never require you to disappear. Love should never cost you your voice. And no position is worth losing yourself for. They begged me back. But the real victory was realizing I no longer needed to beg for my place anywhere. I chose it. And that made all the difference.